If you give most people a bag of chips, they'll dig in without a second thought. If you give a vegan a bag of chips, they'll crouch down, smacking it around with their wrench until it lands with the ingredients list facing up. Then they'll squint really hard and try to read the incredibly compressed text, eventually giving up and deciding to take a screenshot to bring it into Photoshop so they can play around with the brightness and contrast to see if that helps. It won't help though. There's no way to tell for certain by the packaging if these potato chips are made with eggs, milk, or some sort of ground up bits of cat. So they decide to scour the internet for a higher resolution image of Captain Salty's potato chips, which does exist, but only for the front side. Realizing that this avenue isn't panning out, they'll start digging through the game's data themselves until they find a list of .blk files that seem to be generally around where the textures should be stored. The problem then is that they don't know exactly what a .blk file is or how to view its contents. But after some further researching online, they'll discover that it's apparently a file extension used exclusively by AutoCAD, which they do not own. They'll briefly consider the criminal offense of torrenting AutoCAD solely to commit to this stupid bit, but instead they'll stop themselves and decide to check out the BioShock wiki for potential further clues. At the bottom of the wiki article on potato chips, they'll find the link to a nearly half-decade outdated portfolio of the artist who originally designed the bag for Captain Salty's potato chips, a Mr. James Sharp. Turning to Twitter, they'll then attempt to message Mr. Sharp privately, only to find that he doesn't just let any strange plant-based stalker slide into his DMs, forcing them to make a public post asking him if he can remember the exact ingredient list of a single throwaway art asset from a game he worked on back when George W. Bush was still in office.
Ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
While eagerly waiting for his reply, standing over this bag of chips and slowly succumbing to hunger, a dark realization will set in. Here in the slowly crumbling objectivist wet dream that is the city of Rapture, what higher authority would hold Captain Salty accountable to accurately listing his potato chips ingredients? What board of oversight or consumer protection group would be permitted to exist in a city whose sole narrative purpose is to function as a straw man for dunking on libertarians? And this is when the vegan fully realizes that they can never truly know whether or not this bag of chips, let alone any processed food manufactured in Rapture, is safe for their ethical consumption. Luckily for them, eating food isn't a necessity in order to complete the game. Anyway, immediately after this, in order to progress, you're forced to inject a plasmid, which is derived from sea slugs, and, that's definitely not vegan. So, yeah, BioShock is a bad game. Playing BioShock while trying to be as vegan as possible. Initially, this playthrough concept started as a silly shitpost idea. Something similar to the various challenge runs of other games that constantly barrage my recommended videos here on YouTube. I booted the game up and didn't expect too much to be different other than aggressively avoiding the cheeky brand pet bars, as they're most likely made from milk chocolate. But as I played through the game and began to understand just how much content would be unavailable, the results were kind of staggering. When I remembered that Adam, the basis for basically every magic ability in BioShock, was processed from sea slugs, I resigned myself to the prospect of a challenging playthrough where I'd be simply forced to not set people on fire with my mind. But then I picked up a pistol, the first source of what I believed would be vegan-friendly firepower that I could find, and I noticed something disturbing. A leather grip. Leather is most certainly not vegan. And it was at this point that I stopped to consider whether or not this playthrough would be worth it. It sincerely seemed like I was about to commit myself to a wrench-only run of BioShock, which, mind you, playing with no other restrictions isn't a terrible prospect. With a host of tonic upgrades available in the game for the wrench, it can be arguably the best weapon. Unfortunately, I can't use tonics because they're not vegan, also being derived from processed Adam. That makes the wrench go from possibly the best weapon to the worst. I nearly turned the game off right there. But then my resolve kicked in, and I remembered the timeless JFK quote.
We choose to do a vegan playthrough of BioShock, not because it is easy, but because we are unemployed thanks to the novel coronavirus, and have nothing better to do with our time.
So, without further ado, let me show you how all this went down. The game kicks off as normal. I'm enjoying a cigarette on an airplane like any regular Joe would, and looking at a beloved family photograph in my leather wall. Oh, god damn it. Haven't finished the first cutscene yet, but that's already a failed run. Great. Okay, for the sake of simplicity, we're only going to count the actions that I, as the player, am in control of, as being against the rules. Anyway, I crash land in the ocean, swimming toward a lighthouse in the distance while trying not to think about the lasting ecological damage that this plane crash will have on the ecosystem. Inside the lighthouse, I'm greeted to an elaborately decorated chamber hailing the tenets of science, industry, and art. Curiously, the fourth tenet, the libertarian ethos, abolishing age of consent laws, was missing, but whatever. I stepped into the bathysphere to descend below while listening to a recording of a Walt Disney lookalike ranting about how his child laborers have a right to purchase heroin and that no government has the authority to take that from him. Having arrived in the city of Rapture proper, I kicked off my stay by watching a man get disemboweled, and was then asked by a strangely compelling individual to kindly take the radio on the wall so that he could serve as my guide. I found a wrench to break my way through a small barricade, dodged a flaming couch, and then I hit my very first ethical dilemma.
Come back!
According to Wikipedia, the free online encyclopedia that anyone can edit, at its core, veganism is the practice of abstaining from the use of animal products, particularly in diet, and an associated philosophy that rejects the commodity status of animals. Open bracket, lowercase c, closed bracket. While this definition covers veganism at its basis, it is by no means all-encompassing, and doesn't take into account certain, let's call them outlier loopholes, that, if I so chose to, could be used to skirt around the spirit of this run through an entirely legalistic basis. For instance, let's say that, while I would obviously not seek out a bear to murder it, would I be justified in killing a bear in self-defense? Some would likely say yes, and sure, if in some real-life scenario I were thrown into an unavoidable situation that saw me pitted in battle to the death against a bear, and my victory was the only means of survival, I would obviously defend myself, very briefly before being mauled to death. But, by my own personal code of ethics, were I to walk into a grizzly bear's cavern, wearing a salmon costume and begin harassing its babies, I personally don't feel that any action I take afterward in self-defense could be considered justifiably vegan after it inevitably takes issue with my bullshit. In order to consider this run vegan in a way that I can deem acceptable, I can't go around provoking attacks from animals and then defending myself, claiming it justified. So my question then is, are humans not just animals themselves with an elevated sentience? Would I truly be able to consider myself a vegan if I killed this marauder standing before me? Ultimately, I didn't ponder this dilemma for long though, because after he hit me in the face with a lead pipe, instinct kicked in and I proceeded to beat him to death with a superior plumbing instrument. While my character could be easily considered a foreign provocateur in this city, thereby falling into my bear analogy, it seems purposefully obtuse to consider every defensive act of violence that I undertake here to be a moral failing. A, because the game doesn't provide an alternative to violent outcome, and B, because come on man, I'm already doing all this extraneous bullshit to be funny. The run's supposed to be playing BioShock while trying to be as vegan as possible, not playing BioShock while being a whiny vegan loser that can't ethically justify his own self-preservation. In the end, I think I'm just gonna run with, self-defense is perfectly vegan if it's against another sentient individual. Just because I won't eat a steak doesn't mean I'm gonna let you treat me like a bitch. As alluded to earlier, I spent way too long trying to figure out if I could eat any food before ultimately committing to just avoid it all, and shortly thereafter realized that I cannot progress further into the game without first injecting a plasmid, thereby committing a non-vegan action. Rather than ending the playthrough there though, I decided to keep a running tally of just how many non-vegan actions you're forced to make over the course of a playthrough, and use that to determine just how truly awful the game is. If any of you take issue with me using this as my sole basis of judgment, please feel free to voice your opinion in the comments below. I will use my accrued knowledge from nearly a dozen playthroughs of BioShock to shred your argument to bits and prove to you how this game that I'm a huge fan of is actually bad and that you are stupid and that nobody likes you. Waking from my failed balcony fall suicide attempt, I hear a strange cockney voice growling out some nonsensical mixed metaphor before quickly scampering off.
This little fish looks like he just had his cherry popped. Wonder if he...
Suddenly, my field of vision, controlled by the game's developers mind you, seems to hyperfixate, making the primary focus of my view a pair of little girls' uncovered feet. I'm not making any actionable defamatory statement here, but may want to look into BioShock's art director. After those two run off and I wake back up, we're forced to make our second non-vegan action using the plasmid we just injected. Two non-vegan actions if you get a bit too drunk while recording gameplay footage and somehow manage to miss a stationary target entirely on your first attempt. Moving through the tunnel ahead, a huge chunk of plane comes careening from above, crashing through the glass barrier and sending water pouring in to slowly fill the area. I'm not exactly a physics guy, but Google is, and it tells me that Rapture is around 1150 fathoms under the sea. That puts us at about 200 atmospheres of pressure being exerted on this glass, or around 2900 psi. So, 3 things. 1, if that glass broke, this tunnel and myself are getting absolutely annihilated in a split second by the sheer pressure of the water that would burst through in the blink of an eye. 2, this one is sheer speculation. Feel free to correct me in the comments, but I don't really know if that plane could have done anything to the glass if we're to assume it's already capable of withstanding that much consistent external compression. 3, I literally just spent 2 hours in the previous room looking at ingredient labels. It couldn't have taken it that long to fall this far. I found some cigarettes, and before diving into yet another deep Google trench, realized that all they do is restore Eve at the cost of health, which I don't even need. Atlas came in over the radio and suggested I use the electrobolt plasmid to give the splicers the old 1-2 punch.
Zap 'em, then whack 'em. 1-2 punch. Remember, the 1-2 punch.
But personally, I was getting along just fine relying on the old 1-1 miss 1-1-1 punch.
You don't see moves like that every day, folks!
I took note while looting some corpses that whenever I went to grab items from them, it forces you to take every item contained within. This means that certain corpses and containers become little anti-vegan booby traps. For instance, maybe a desk holds a few stacks of cash, but also a cream-filled cake, just waiting for me to grab that money, knowing that I'll be powerless to stop myself from consuming it because all food items are automatically eaten when picked up. I need to remain extra vigilant for stuff like this, but ultimately a few snuck through here and there, forcing me to reload my save way too often. Also, you may have noticed that I've been picking up Eve hypos even though we've established that they're non-vegan due to the source from which they derive. Personally, I think it would be against my code of ethics to consume or use the item, but to carry it around because the game forces me to pick it up without being able to put it down, I don't see a problem. Sure, if some splicer walked by and saw me carrying them, they would probably think, "That guy's not vegan at all." But I'm not being a vegan as some sort of performative display to feel superior to others. That's just a side benefit. I'm a vegan because I've attempted to face my own cognitive dissonance, and know that I can live out a perfectly fulfilling existence while minimizing the needless suffering of other creatures. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to bludgeon this woman to death with a wrench. Moving on, I took an elevator up to the floor above, grabbed a pistol from a baby carriage, but then imprisoned it in my pocket, never to see the light of day again due to its previously mentioned leather grip. I found a bottle of whiskey, and after consulting with the council, came to the determination that unless a distillery is really going out of its way to be a dick, distilled spirits, and specifically a whiskey brand that alternatively goes by the name Old Hat, shouldn't have any extra bullshit added to make it non-vegan, unless explicitly stating otherwise. This is kinda convenient, seeing as how hard liquors in BioShock provide health at the cost of Eve. In a way, this sort of makes them the opposite of cigarettes, and I can only assume that these properties reflect their real-world effects. So to stay healthy, I'm going to start drinking hard liquor every day. No, I'm just kidding. I already do that. Oh, also, wine can't be assumed vegan. Wine is clarified through a process called fining, which most often uses one of a variety of animal products. Not really bothered by this because I prefer liquor anyway. To me, alcohol is just a means to an end, and wine is adding unnecessary calories and very unpleasant hangovers to the mix. Did you know that not all paper currencies are vegan? Certain polymer-based currencies use tallow or animal fat as a component to increase its durability and longevity. Going slightly off of assumption, and a bit of visual implication, the Rapture dollar appears to be heavily inspired by the US dollar, which, luckily for us, is vegan. And let me just say, thank God, because if I couldn't use money in this run, I probably just wouldn't do it. That would somehow be the breaking point where I decided this was too much of a hassle. Moving through a kitchen, I get a bit of brief insight into what sort of meals the people of Rapture ate before they reverted into this state of ballroom wizard junkies that I'm currently dealing with. From my brief inspection, the spread seems to consist of alcohol, steak, canned beans, and feces? Or maybe mud? I don't know, I didn't stop to taste test. You know, because feces wouldn't be vegan. So the first time we see this little girl, it's a close-up shot of her feet. The second time, she's being brutally pistol whipped. Personally, I'm a little too busy right now inspecting food packages with a fine-tooth comb, but if one of you guys just so happen to think it's appropriate to report someone involved with the development of this game to the FBI's anonymous tip page, I am not personally saying you should, but I'm just going to go ahead and put the link up here as a QR code, and you do what you think is best. Nearly to my destination, I got a bit too drunk off of whiskey and accidentally triggered an alarm while digging through the trash, leading to a huge showdown.
Attention, surrender of whiskey.
I'd be upset, but I'm honestly not surprised that a city filled with objectivists would respond this way to such a heinous crime as acting like a homeless person.
This is illegal, you idiot.
Luckily though, I made it out alive, if not a bit toasty.
I want to train your ass.
At the last moment before escaping to the medical pavilion, the door suddenly locked in front of me, and Mr. House appeared on the screen from behind, referring to me as friend.
So tell me, friend, which one of the bitches sent you?
I laughed in response because I do not befriend those who use the names of animals in a derogatory way.
Animals are innocent. Don't be speciesist. Never use the name of an animal as an insult for a human.
As I delve deeper into the chaotic depths of Rapture, my mind races as to what lies ahead. What atrocity will I next be compelled to commit? What resources will I be forced to leave behind? And what other everyday object will I suddenly discover is refined from, like, horse scrotum for no discernible reason? To be continued in part 2.